Hello, everyone. My name is Gladys Morrison. I'm 34 years old, and last month, the life I built entirely with my own hands finally became strong enough to expose the truth my family spent years hiding. The night I closed the door on them, on my mother, on my sister Quinn, was the first night their stories stopped ruling my life. And the consequences they faced afterward were nothing like the future they had imagined for themselves. Before I tell you how everything unfolded on my new front porch, how a folder of paperwork changed the balance of an entire family, please like this video, subscribe, and tell me where you're watching from. It genuinely helps these stories travel, and I love seeing how far they go. Now, let me start from the beginning. For the past 13 years, I lived the kind of life that survives rather than blooms. Work, sleep, bills, repeat. No family dinners, no drop-ins, no holiday invitations, no mother who called just to check, no sister who remembered my birthday unless it fit a dramatic narrative she was posting online. I ran Morrison Midnight Bakery, a late-night dessert business tucked inside a rented industrial kitchen in Portland's Hawthorne district. When the city slept, my ovens hummed. When the streets were empty, my mixers roared. And for the first time in a long time, effort finally translated into something predictable. Income, stability, progress. Then suddenly, it happened. Orders doubled, then tripled. A corporate contract, a cafe chain deal. For the first time, the numbers whispered something I had never dared to say out loud. You can leave the tiny apartment behind. You can choose something bigger. And so I did. I bought a house in Richmond Hill, a quiet craftsman with a long porch, warm floors, and a kitchen that felt like a promise. I moved in with nothing but a folding chair, a box of leftover almond toffee bars, and the strange trembling hope that maybe, finally, I was stepping into a life built entirely by my own hands. That first night, silence didn't feel lonely. It felt earned. I walked through every room in slow, deliberate circles, memorizing the emptiness with a kind of reverence. For most people, a house is shelter. For me, it was proof. Proof that I wasn't the version of myself my family had insisted I was. Proof that I could build something solid out of all the years I spent being blamed for everything that cracked inside a household I couldn't fix. But the thing about silence is that it doesn't stay untouched for long. The very next morning, before I even finished my coffee, my past appeared on my doorstep. At first, I didn't believe the shapes on the security camera screen. I thought it was a glitch, a delivery mistake, someone turning around in the driveway. But then the picture sharpened. Two figures stepped out of a car with the sort of ease that only comes from people who believe they still own part of your life. One carried a suitcase. The other straightened her sweater like she was preparing to walk into a house she assumed belonged to her. 13 years. 13 years without a holiday phone call, without an apology, without an ounce of interest in my survival. And there they were. Quinn Morrison, my younger sister, walking with the same practiced fragility that always bent the entire household around her. And behind her, Eleanor Morrison, my mother, wearing that tight, assessing expression she saved only for me. The one that suggested I was already in the wrong before I even opened my mouth. My hand tightened around my coffee mug. Not out of panic, out of clarity. I had expected many things in my new life. Late-night baking shifts, inventory spreadsheets, quiet mornings where no one demanded anything from me. What I had not expected was them. I should tell you something now, something that will matter later, especially when we reach the part where consequences finally land, where they always should have. My mother and sister did not come because they missed me. They did not come to reconnect. They came because, in their minds, my stability was still something they were entitled to. They came because they believed the version of me they had crafted, the responsible one, the silent one, the one who absorbed everything, still existed. What they didn't know was that the woman inside this house was someone they had never met. The version of me who kept records. The version who set boundaries in writing. The version who had already placed a folder, the Morrison boundary packet, on the table by the door days ago, long before they arrived. Because somewhere deep down, I must have known. When you finally stop shrinking to fit someone else's shape, the people who benefited from your smallness always come back, confused, offended, and ready to rewrite the story. And that is exactly where this begins. Most people think family patterns begin with one dramatic moment, a fight, a betrayal, a slammed door that echoes for years. But the truth is quieter than that. In my family, the pattern didn't start with shouting. It started with small adjustments, tiny shifts in how the air in the house moved, depending on who was speaking, who was crying, who was watching. And when I look back, tracing the lines all the way to the girl I used to be, I see those shifts everywhere. I grew up learning responsibility the way other kids learned piano or soccer drills, through expectation, repetition, and the unspoken rule that nothing in the house ran smoothly unless I was holding the edges together. I was the oldest daughter, the one who remembered everything, carried everything, cleaned everything, anticipated everything before it broke. If milk ran out, the blame drifted toward me. If someone overslept, I should have reminded them. If plans changed, I was expected to rearrange myself around them. And then there was Quinn Morrison, the girl who grew up under an entirely different sky. My younger sister had a softness people mistook for fragility, a wide-eyed innocence that worked on adults like a spell. If she scraped her knee, the world paused. If she forgot something, excuses appeared instantly. If she cried, the house shifted around her like she was the axis holding it all in place. I don't remember resenting her in those early years. I remember adapting. If Quinn was tired, the volume lowered in every room. If Quinn was stressed, we tiptoed. If Quinn felt overwhelmed, the entire schedule bent to accommodate her. She lived in a world padded by accommodation, while I lived in the space that absorbed all consequences. My mother, Eleanor, carried a constant worry that draped itself over Quinn like a protective blanket. She guarded her, soothed her, rearranged the atmosphere to keep her calm. But for me, her affection held weight, expectations, assumptions, responsibility. It always felt like I was being measured against a standard I never agreed to. I learned early. I was the solution. Quinn was the one who needed saving. In a different family, maybe that dynamic would have softened over time. But in ours, it calcified. The first moment I realized something was off came in the kitchen when I was barely a teenager. A small amount of money, barely enough to buy a snack after school, went missing from Quinn's room. She couldn't find it. Her breath hitched, tears trembling at the edges of her lashes, her palms turning upward as if the entire world had chosen that day to betray her. Before I even spoke, the room shifted. My mother's expression tightened, not angry but disappointed in a way that wrapped itself around my ribs. "I didn't touch it," I said quietly. It didn't matter. In our house, Quinn's emotions were treated like evidence. My explanations were treated like complications. She wasn't malicious about it. Not then, not yet. She simply understood something long before I did. Vulnerability could be a form of power, especially when everyone around you rushes to protect it. The missing money incident was small, insignificant if you looked at the numbers. But it was the moment I understood how truth worked in our family. It didn't matter what actually happened. It mattered who cried first. And it was almost never me. From then on, the rhythm became predictable. If Quinn had a late project, it was assumed I didn't remind her. If she missed the bus, I was blamed for taking too long or not waking her. If she seemed anxious, I was told I wasn't supportive enough. Most of these accusations were unspoken, but unspoken things accumulate like dust, quiet, persistent, settling into every corner until the entire house feels coated in something you can't scrub off. I should have rebelled. I should have defended myself more loudly. But in a home where feelings outweighed facts, logic became pointless. Every attempt to clarify my innocence only reinforced the idea that I was making things harder. So I did the only thing that kept the peace. I adapted even more. I took on rides, chores, errands, extra shifts at the local diner when I was barely old enough to drive. I brought home small paychecks to fill whatever gaps I saw. I stayed out of trouble. I stayed quiet. And silence, in a household like mine, becomes its own kind of identity. There was another moment, one I didn't understand fully until years later. I overheard my mother on the phone with a relative, her voice low but sharp enough to cut through walls. "Quinn is sensitive," she said. "Gladys, well, she's strong. She can handle more." Strong. That word lingered like a strange kind of punishment. People like to romanticize strength, call it admirable, inspiring, noble. But when you're a child, being labeled the strong one is just a polite way of saying, your pain doesn't matter as much as someone else's. From that point forward, I could see the pattern with painful clarity. Quinn cried? Eleanor comforted her. I cried? She frowned and asked, "What happened now?" Quinn made a mistake? Someone else was blamed. I made a mistake? It confirmed everything they already suspected about me. Even the way relatives interacted with us reinforced the divide. Quinn was the sweet one, the delicate one, the one who needed protection. I was the capable one, the fixer, the helper, the older sister who could take it. Except I couldn't. Not forever. The roles were set long before any of us realized we were performing them. Quinn, the protected orbit. Eleanor, the anxious mother rotating around her. Me, the gravity holding everything else in place. But gravity cracks under pressure too. The turning point didn't announce itself with shouting or catastrophe. It arrived on a quiet, gray morning, the kind of morning where you expect nothing more dramatic than a late bus or a forgotten lunchbox. Looking back, I think that's why it cut so deeply. Dramatic disasters are easier to process. Quiet betrayals settle deeper. At the time, I had an old sedan I drove everywhere. School, work shifts, errands for the house. The car wasn't special, but it was mine. It represented long hours at the diner, scraped savings, and the kind of independence I'd been learning to build inch by inch. That morning, Quinn asked if she could borrow it. She stood in the doorway, wrapped in her puffy jacket, twisting her hands with that familiar mixture of nerves and anticipation that always melted adults around her. "I just need to run a quick errand before school," she said. "Please, I won't be long." I hesitated. Not because I didn't trust her, but because the car was fragile, and I knew she was careless in ways she didn't recognize. But my hesitation lasted only a breath, because in our house, denying Quinn felt like a moral offense. So I handed her the keys. I didn't know that simple gesture would blow a crack straight through the foundation of our family. She was gone longer than a quick errand. By the time she returned, I could hear her before I saw her. The front door clicked open slowly, then shut with a softness that felt rehearsed. Her steps weren't rushed, just careful, too careful. I walked into the kitchen and found her standing there, hunched slightly, coat clutched in her fists like she was bracing for impact. "Quinn?" I asked. Her eyes shimmered, breath uneven, as if she were preparing to collapse into the nearest arms. "I'm so sorry," she whispered, but the apology wasn't actually directed at me. From the moment she looked up, with that fragile, trembling expression I knew too well, the entire house shifted. I felt it before my mother even walked in. "What happened?" Eleanor asked, already stepping toward Quinn, not toward the truth. Quinn swallowed hard. I think something happened to the car." I should have run outside then, but I froze. Not because I was afraid of the damage, though I should have been, but because I recognized the unfolding choreography. A story was forming, shaped not by facts but by emotion. We all went outside together, and there it was, the front bumper dented inward, paint scraped in a long, harsh streak. A wound across metal, undeniable, unmistakable, expensive. My stomach dropped, not out of anger, out of certainty. Because in that moment, before a single accusation was spoken. I already knew the conclusion had been drawn. Gladys, my mother said, turning to me with that same disappointed crease between her brows. Why would you let the car get like this? I blinked. The car wasn't like this, I said quietly. Not before she left. Quinn flinched, a soft gesture that pulled attention like gravity. I didn't mean for anything to happen, she whispered, voice cracking just enough to tilt the world in her direction. I was just scared. And I thought maybe it was already dented and I didn't notice. That was all it took. Not a lie, just the suggestion of a possibility. A tone designed to confuse. A softness that floated blame into the air without landing it anywhere near her. My mother inhaled sharply, the way she always did when she felt protective. This is exactly why you need to be more responsible, Gladys, she said to me. You know your sister gets anxious. You should have reminded her to be careful. I stared at her. Remind her to be careful? Remind her the laws of physics apply to everyone? I wasn't even there, I said. She was the one driving. But logic had no place in this dynamic. It never had. Eleanor crossed her arms. You shouldn't have let her use the car if it wasn't in good shape. It was in good shape, I said. I maintain it. I pay for all the repairs. Quinn's chin trembled. I didn't mean for it to get worse, as if the damage existed before she touched it. As if I, a 17-year-old working back-to-back shifts, was the negligent one. A familiar heaviness settled over me then, the realization that truth was irrelevant in a household that worshipped fragile feelings. I sensed it happening, the silent verdict forming. I could almost hear the locks clicking into place. Eleanor turned to me, shaking her head like I had disappointed her personally. You need to take more responsibility, Gladys. You know how easily overwhelmed your sister becomes. And just like that, Quinn was absolved. And I was the problem again. Something inside me cracked. Not loudly, not visibly, but quietly, like a fault line deep underground finally shifting after years of ignored pressure. I didn't yell, I didn't defend myself, I didn't cry. I just stood there, watching the two of them hover around each other, their shared narrative tightening like a cocoon. I was the outsider again. Not because I had done anything wrong, but because someone else's anxiety was easier to protect than my reality. Later that evening, I sat on the edge of my bed staring at the car keys still lying on my desk. My hands felt foreign, as if they belonged to someone older, someone tired. And for the first time, I asked myself a question I had been too afraid to say out loud. If I left, would anyone even notice I was gone? Not in the dramatic sense. Not in the way someone cries when a person disappears, but in the deeper sense. Would the house run any differently? Would anyone lose anything except the convenience of having me there? That question never left me. It followed me into adulthood, into every job, into every apartment, into every moment I learned to survive alone. There are moments that split a life cleanly in two, not with fireworks, not with slammed doors, but with a quiet realization that staying will cost more than leaving ever could. For me, that moment was the dented car, standing in the driveway with blame pressed against my shoulders like an old, familiar weight. I didn't leave that day, or even that week, but something inside me stepped away long before my body ever did. The house kept moving around me, but I no longer moved with it. I began saving in secret. Not out of rebellion, not because I had a plan, but because I needed proof. Proof that I could fund some version of a life where I wasn't the default culprit. Proof that I could build something without being blamed for breathing wrong. I picked up extra shifts at the diner. I stayed late whenever the manager asked. I worked mornings, afternoons, weekends, anything that filled the hours and dulled the exhaustion settling at the edge of my bones. Work became a language I understood. Effort in, results out. No emotional negotiations. No rewrites of truth. Just tasks, completed and compensated. Meanwhile, home became a place I passed through rather than lived in. Conversations grew shorter. Silence stretched longer. Gatherings happened without me, or I found out about them only when empty plates or leftover confetti revealed themselves on the dining table. No one pushed me out, but every unnoticed absence felt like a gentle nudge toward the door. Then one night, after a double shift that left grease on my elbows and the smell of coffee embedded deep into my clothes, I came home to a conversation I wasn't meant to hear. My mother's voice floated from the living room, soft but edged. "Gladys is drifting. I don't know what to do with her. She makes everything harder." A relative murmured something sympathetic. I didn't need to hear the rest. In that moment, whatever small part of me had been waiting for someone to ask what I needed, or how I felt, or why I stayed so quiet, simply extinguished. If I was already the difficult child in their story, then leaving wasn't a betrayal. It was alignment. When I finally moved out, it didn't look like a dramatic exit. I carried 2 bags of clothes, a box of notebooks, and a dented pair of baking pans I'd bought secondhand. No one stopped me. No one asked where I was going. They just assumed I'd come back. I didn't. I rented the cheapest studio apartment I could find on the east side of Portland. So small I could reach the fridge from my bed, so old the heater rattled like it was filing a complaint. But it was quiet, and more importantly, it was mine. The first night I slept on the floor. The second night, too. And somewhere in that silence, something inside me loosened. But leaving didn't reset anything. If anything, the distance made the narrative stronger. According to my family, I had chosen my own life over them. I had pulled away. I had abandoned the people who needed me. Funny how people rewrite history when they lose access to your labor. For years, I worked every job that kept the rent paid. I brewed coffee before dawn in a shop that always felt too cold. I cleaned office buildings after dark, the fluorescent lights humming above me like a restless conscience. I delivered pastries for a bakery that paid in cash and leftover croissants. I folded laundry for people who didn't know my name. Every job taught me something, not about skill or ambition, but about how it feels to build a life with hands that no one else believed in. I kept to myself. I didn't correct the stories circulating among the Morrison relatives, the posts Quinn wrote online about betrayal, healing, and being left behind. She never said my name, but everyone who knew us connected the dots instantly. People sent her supportive messages. "You're so strong." Some sisters just don't understand. Family wounds cut the deepest. I stayed silent. I didn't argue. I didn't explain. Not because I was guilty, but because I was tired. Protecting my truth had become a luxury I couldn't afford. Years passed in repetitions, shift after shift, paycheck after paycheck. I learned how to mix batter while the city slept. I learned how to stretch $20 over 3 days. I learned that loneliness, once you stop fighting it, becomes surprisingly peaceful. 13 years is a long time to live outside a family's orbit. Long enough that the silence becomes a landscape. Long enough that you stop expecting reconciliation. Long enough that the version of you they talk about feels like a stranger you've never actually met. But even while I moved on, the story they built about me stayed exactly the same. I was the one who broke away, the cause of the distance, the villain of a narrative where Quinn was always the injured party, and Eleanor was the weary mother who tried her best. It didn't matter that none of it was true. It mattered that it was easy, and when people don't want the truth, they cling to convenience. But there was one thing my mother and sister did not anticipate. Distance didn't weaken me. It clarified me. The longer I lived alone, the clearer my edges became. I learned what I valued, what I could no longer accept, and what boundaries I would defend without apology. And slowly, quietly, something new took shape. I found baking again, not as an obligation, not as a chore, but as breath. I began selling small batches to coworkers, then friends of coworkers. Then I rented a shared kitchen. Then orders grew. I didn't know it then, but the road to Morrison Midnight Bakery, the life-changing contracts, the exhaustion with purpose, the house in Richmond Hill, began in that cramped studio apartment with one bowl, one whisk, and one decision. I won't live in a story someone else writes for me. Growth almost never feels like growth when you're living it. It feels like fatigue, like long nights, like choosing effort even when no one is watching, no one applauding, no one validating the tiny steps forward. Looking back now, the rise of Morrison Midnight Bakery seems almost cinematic, clean, linear, triumphant. But living through it? It felt like chasing stability in the dark. It began in a shared industrial kitchen, Hawthorne Culinary Hub, where the air always smelled like metal and detergent, and the hum of freezers echoed through the hallways long after midnight. The kitchen wasn't glamorous, it wasn't even comfortable, but it was cheap, and more importantly, it offered hours no one else wanted. Those hours became my sanctuary. I'd unlock the metal door at 11 p.m., step into the cold fluorescent light, and let silence settle over me like a second skin. While the rest of Portland slept, I whisked batter until my arms trembled, balanced trays like fragile promises, and experimented with every recipe I had written in the margins of old notebooks. It started small. A box of cookies for a coworker's office, 24 bars for a friend's birthday, 5 boxes of pastries for someone's weekend gathering. Nothing dramatic, nothing loud. But every week, the number ticked upward. 5 became 7. 7 became 10. 10 turned into, "Hey, my boss wants to order from you for a meeting." And then came the moment everything shifted. One evening, exhausted and dusted with sugar, I received a message from a woman named Claire, an office manager from Northwest Meridian Office Center. "Hi Gladys, someone brought your almond toffee bars to a team event last week. Can you fulfill a bulk order for our corporate retreat?" Bulk, corporate, retreat. 3 words I'd never seen directed at me in the same sentence. I said yes before fear could catch up. For the next several days, the kitchen became my entire world. I baked until my shoulders ached. I labeled boxes with meticulous precision. I timed each batch like the smallest delay might shatter the opportunity. The night before the delivery, I remember staring at the neatly stacked boxes, dozens of them, lined like soldiers waiting for inspection, and thinking, if this fails, it fails because of effort, not lack of it. But it didn't fail. It landed. 2 days later, the office ordered again, then again. And by the end of the month, word had traveled through corporate teams like wildfire. My once quiet midnight hours filled with demand. More trays, more flavors, more responsibility. The notebook where I tracked my expenses started looking less like a survival log and more like the foundation of something real. That was the first time I allowed myself to believe I wasn't just surviving anymore. I was building. Of course, scaling meant change. The shared kitchen wasn't enough. I needed more space, more refrigeration, more ovens that wouldn't be stolen by the 7 a.m. bakers the moment my rental slot ended. I started touring small industrial units, spaces wedged between auto shops and warehouses, places that smelled like oil, rust, and possibility. Most were too expensive, some were too cramped. But one, a narrow unit on Belmont Industrial Row, felt right the moment I stepped inside. It wasn't pretty, it wasn't even clean yet. But when I closed my eyes, I could see it. Shelves lined with ingredients, prep tables stretching across the room, trays cooling in even, orderly rows. Signing the rental contract felt like stepping onto new ground. An act of faith in a future version of myself I hadn't met yet. That space became the first permanent home of Morrison Midnight Bakery. With more room came more responsibility. I bought sturdier mixing bowls, a second set of baking pans, a proper labeling system, an industrial fridge I found after scrolling through dozens of online listings. And somewhere between the chaos and the overtime, I hired my first part-time helper, a quiet college student named Tessa Lynn, who had a gift for organizing packing stations and never complained about late hours. Having her in the kitchen felt strange at first, like I was sharing a secret I'd held too tightly. But the moment she taped her first box perfectly straight, I knew the bakery finally had a rhythm that didn't rely solely on my hands. Then came the call that changed everything. A representative from Everbean Coffee Roasters, a regional cafe chain in the Pacific Northwest, had tried one of my dessert bars at a networking event. "We'd like to discuss weekly deliveries," she said. "Multiple locations, consistent volume." I remember sitting down on the kitchen floor, back against the cold metal fridge, phone pressed to my cheek, heart racing in the dark. Weekly deliveries, to a chain, with scheduled invoices. It wasn't wealth, but it was stability. And stability was something I had chased for half my life. When we finalized the agreement, it felt surreal. Not because of the money, but because this was the first contract I had ever signed that wasn't tied to the Morrison household in any way. No emotional strings, no accusations, no hidden expectations, just skill, effort, value. And something shifted in me during those months. Something subtle, but seismic. I began to see myself not as the girl who was always blamed, but as a woman who could create something from nothing and hold it steady. I began to understand that identity could be reassembled, not by erasing the past, but by refusing to be shaped by it anymore. It took years of night work, endless prep lists, and more exhaustion than I can name. But the bakery grew, the orders grew, and I grew with them. Every morning I arrived home just before sunrise, the city barely stirring. I felt a quiet conviction settle deeper into my bones. I built this life, and no one gets to take it from me. I didn't know then what was coming. The knock on my new door, the suitcases, the entitlement of people who had not spoken to me in over a decade. But the foundation was already there, and soon, someone would try to walk across it as if they still owned it. The morning they appeared felt like a test I hadn't studied for. Not because I wasn't prepared, but because preparing for something and facing it are two entirely different things. I was still getting used to the rhythms of my new home in Richmond Hill. The quiet hallways, the soft hum of the refrigerator, the way sunlight crept through the blinds and painted the kitchen in slow-moving gold. For the first time in years, my mornings had shape, safe, predictable, mine. Then came the sound of tires on gravel, a noise I didn't pay attention to at first. Deliveries happened often. Contractors still came by to finish minor fixes. The neighborhood was active enough that nothing felt unusual. But then my phone buzzed with a motion alert from the security camera. And the moment I opened the feed, something shifted inside me, like the house itself exhaled sharply. Because standing at my front door, after 13 years of silence, were the two people I had least expected to ever see again. Quinn Morrison, posture polished, suitcase in hand, wrapped in the familiar aura of fragile confidence she had perfected long before adulthood. And behind her, Eleanor, my mother, gripping her sweater as if the house, my house, still owed her warmth. They looked like they belonged there. Like the distance between us had been a weekend, not over a decade. Like they were stepping into a chapter of my life they still believed they had the right to edit. I didn't move at first. I watched them on the screen longer than necessary, studying the details, the annoyance already blooming on my mother's face, the subtle entitlement in Quinn's stance, the unspoken assumption that the door would, of course, open for them. I set my coffee down and walked, slowly, to the entry table where the Morrison boundary packet sat waiting. A folder I had assembled quietly, long before this morning, not out of spite, but out of clarity. Guest license, no trespass notice, a ledger documenting years of financial and emotional imbalances, everything written, everything notarized, proof that I would no longer play the unspeaking role they had scripted for me. I held the folder in my hands. It felt heavier than paper, like a promise to the person I had become. Then I opened the door. Not fully, just enough to maintain control, just enough for them to see that I was the one deciding how wide the doorway would be. Quinn took the first step toward me, dragging her suitcase with the kind of confidence that assumed permission rather than asked for it. "Gladys," she said, her voice softening into the tone she used when she expected compliance. "We didn't want to surprise you, we just thought—" But the sentence trailed off as she noticed the narrow gap of the door. Her posture faltered. A fraction, but I saw it. My mother's expression hardened instantly. "Is this how you greet your own family?" she demanded, leaning forward like she expected the doorframe to move out of respect. "Hello," I said calmly. "Why are you here?" That question shifted the balance again. Not aggressive, not emotional. Simply factual. A boundary in sentence form. "We came because we needed a place to stay for a while," Eleanor said, as if that were explanation enough. "Your sister is going through a stressful time." Of course she was. In their world, Quinn was always going through something that required someone else to absorb the consequences. "And you didn't think to call?" I asked. Eleanor's eyes narrowed. "Family shouldn't need appointments." There it was, the assumption wearing its true face. Quinn attempted another soft smile, her practice currency. "It's just temporary, Gladys. We knew you had space now, and we thought, after everything, maybe this could be a fresh start." A fresh start. On my doorstep. Unannounced. With luggage. I didn't respond immediately. Instead, I lifted the folder slightly, not offering it, not hiding it, simply acknowledging it. Their eyes followed the movement. Quinn blinked. "What's that?" "My boundaries," I said. Silence landed heavy in the space between us. I placed the folder on the small console table behind me, the motion deliberate and slow. "You can look at it," I continued, "but it won't change what's inside." My mother scoffed. "Gladys, this is ridiculous. We're not strangers. We don't need paperwork." But we did. Because without paperwork, everything would revert to the old script, and I would be expected to absorb, accommodate, and explain. "This house," I said quietly, "is not an extension of the one you controlled." Eleanor's jaw tightened. "Do you hear yourself? After all we've been through—" "What we've been through," I corrected gently, "is exactly why the folder exists." Quinn looked between us, the familiar flicker of discomfort crossing her features. I recognized it, the moment she realized her usual strategies weren't working. "If you want to visit," I said, "we can schedule that. And if you need support, we can talk about boundaries. But you don't get to arrive unannounced with suitcases and expect entry." "You're being cruel," my mother hissed. "No," I said. "I'm being clear." For the first time in my life, clarity didn't feel like confrontation. It felt like oxygen. I stepped back, not to invite them in, but to physically reinforce the distance, and rested my hand lightly on the door. They both stared at me, stunned by the version of me standing in front of them. The version they had never imagined would appear. The version they could no longer shape. "I hope you take care of yourselves," I said softly, "but you're not coming inside." Then I closed the door. Not slammed, not dramatic, just closed. And the moment the latch clicked into place, the house didn't feel threatened. It felt aligned, finally matching the life I had built inside it. I stood still, letting my breath settle, letting the weight of the moment sink into the floorboards. The Morrison boundary packet sat on the table like a quiet witness. Outside, I could hear muffled voices, confusion, disbelief, irritation. Inside, I heard only my own heartbeat. And for the first time, that was enough. The moment the door clicked shut, the house didn't fall into silence. It settled. As if the walls themselves understood that something long overdue had finally happened. But peace never arrives without resistance. And in my family, resistance had always traveled fastest through whispers, and then through the internet. I'd barely walked back into the kitchen when my phone buzzed, once, twice, then relentlessly. Notifications cascaded across the screen, previews lighting up like a frantic Morse code. At first, I thought it was spam. Then I saw the names. Cousins I hadn't spoken to in a decade. Aunts who had reshared Quinn's melodramatic posts for years. Distant relatives who still treated family narratives like gospel. The messages came in screenshots, posts Quinn had already uploaded. A photo of my front porch, a caption angled just enough to imply cruelty without stating it outright. Sometimes the people you think will help you are the ones who shut you out the hardest. Another, trying to make peace, trying to start over, but not everyone believes in forgiveness. She didn't mention my name. She never needed to. The Morrison family tree had only one daughter who had pulled away, and the online audience knew exactly where to aim their sympathy. My phone pulsed with comments. She turned you away? Seriously? Some people forget where they came from. Family is forever, unless someone thinks they're too good for it. I didn't open any of the threads. I didn't need the details to know the script. This was the same pattern Quinn had used since adolescence. Center herself as the fragile heart. Float vague accusations. Allow others to build the villain for her. And my relatives, ever eager to rescue the version of her they adored, reacted on cue. A long message from Aunt Meredith. You owe your mother compassion. She's been through enough. A cousin I barely remembered. We're all worried about Quinn. She needs you right now. Another cousin, more forceful. You have space now. Don't be selfish. There it was again. The word that had followed me since childhood. Selfish. Not because I ever took too much, but because I finally withheld what they felt entitled to. I set the phone down, not out of defeat, out of clarity. Engaging would pull me into a storm I had spent 13 years climbing out of. Drama thrives on reaction, and silence, intentional silence, was my refusal to fuel it. Instead, I opened my laptop. If Quinn wanted to play out her patterns publicly, I would respond privately, legally, and with boundaries that didn't require permission. Chat show. The email I drafted was short, clean sentences, no emotion to manipulate, no entry points for guilt. To the Morrison extended family, communication will take place through email only. No discussions involving housing, money, or emotional accusations will be acknowledged. Unannounced visits will not be permitted. If boundaries are violated, legal steps outlined in the attached document will be enforced. Sincerely, Gladys Morrison. I attached the Morrison boundary packet, not the full ledger, just the legal notice and guest policy. Enough to make expectations explicit. Enough to make consequences concrete. Then I hit send. Within minutes, more responses arrived, but I didn't open them. The point wasn't conversation. The point was clarity. Later that afternoon, a new email came in, from my mother. It carried no greeting, no warmth, no punctuation, except the period she always used when she thought she was being morally correct. You've broken your sister's heart. It was an old tactic, guilt disguised as righteousness. For years, that single sentence would have gutted me. This time, it didn't land at all. I closed the message without replying. 2 hours later, she wrote again. Longer this time. A stream of sentences about sacrifice, raising 2 daughters alone, how exhausted she had been, how misunderstood Quinn was, how I was being unfair. But buried underneath the theatrics was the same message. Your stability belongs to us. A good daughter wouldn't withhold it. Your boundaries are betrayal. I let the message sit. You cannot reason with someone committed to a narrative that erases you. You cannot argue a person out of a story that protects them from accountability. And I no longer confused silence with surrender. Instead, I opened a blank document and began outlining next steps. Not for drama, not for retaliation, for protection. I wrote down the name of a process server, noted contact information for property law resources, organized every screenshot, message, and timestamp. Not because I wanted to use them, but because I had learned the hard way that people who feel entitled to your life don't stop at the first boundary. Preparation wasn't paranoia. It was self-respect. In the days that followed, the online noise swelled and then settled the way all unearned outrage does. People lose interest when their assumptions aren't fed. Quinn continued posting vague sentiments. You try to forgive, and some people slam the door right in your face. Family shouldn't hurt like this. Her audience responded dutifully, showering her with digital sympathy. But she never tagged me, never said my name, because that would require accountability. Meanwhile, I returned to the rhythm of the bakery. Production lists, deliveries, invoices, real things, tangible things. Life didn't collapse just because chaos demanded attention. In fact, it held steady, maybe more steady than before. And that steadiness was proof. Proof that breaking old patterns doesn't break you. Still, every evening when I passed the entryway table, my eyes drifted to the Morrison boundary packet. Its quiet presence reminded me that the hardest part wasn't closing the door. It was staying firm afterward. People don't like losing the version of you they benefited from. They'll try guilt, shame, distortion, public sympathy campaigns, but once you've learned to live without their approval, their tricks lose their power. And though the worst of the storm had passed, the true shift hadn't happened yet. Not for Quinn. Not for my mother. Time has a way of testing boundaries long after the moment you draw them. Anyone can close a door once, but holding it shut, calmly, consistently, while old habits push against it, that's where the real transformation happens. In the weeks after I sent the boundary email, the noise slowly faded, screenshots slowed, accusations thinned out. The Morrison relatives found new stories to latch onto, stories that didn't require questioning their long-held assumptions. What surprised me wasn't the quiet, it was how natural it felt. I had spent so many years thinking peace had to be earned through compliance. But peace, it turned out, arrived the moment I stopped auditioning for approval. About 3 months after the confrontation at my door, an email from Quinn appeared in my inbox. No dramatics, no guilt-laced lines, no wounded metaphors about betrayal. Just a simple subject title. Work? Inside, a single question. Do you know any places hiring for flexible shifts? I stared at it for a long moment, not because I was shocked, but because this was the first message from her that wasn't crafted to manipulate the narrative. There was no emotional currency attached, no expectation that I'd sacrifice something for her comfort, just a question grounded in the real world. I didn't invite her into the bakery, I didn't offer her rescue, but I did reply with a short list: agencies, local shops, places known for hiring beginners without theatrics. It felt like the right kind of help. Help with edges. Help with limits. A few weeks later, she wrote again. This time there was no text at all. Only a photo. Quinn standing under the harsh fluorescent lights of what looked like a small retail shop, hair pulled back, uniform on. A clipped employee badge half hidden by her collar. She wasn't posing. She wasn't performing fragility. She just was. I saved the picture, not as proof she had become someone new, but as a quiet marker that she was finally stepping into her own gravity. For the first time, she looked like a person trying to live her life, rather than curate a narrative. Her posts online changed too, less about heartbreak, more about late shifts, tired feet, coworker mishaps, and the strange camaraderie of survival. I didn't monitor her page. The updates reached me through acquaintances who hadn't yet removed me from their digital orbit. But I didn't feel threatened by the mention of her progress. Growth doesn't require an audience. And neither does forgiveness. Not the cinematic kind, but the truthful kind. The kind that doesn't erase boundaries to make other people comfortable. Around the 6-month mark, my mother reached out. Not with accusations this time, but with something else entirely. A short message. Could I see the house one day? No sermon, no emotional leverage. Just a request. Plain, stripped of performance. I didn't say yes immediately. Clarity isn't coldness, but it is careful. After thinking on it, I replied with specifics. A certain day, a certain time, and only her. When the day came, she stepped into my home with a kind of quiet I had never seen from her. She didn't inspect, she didn't critique, she didn't make passive comments about what I could have done differently. She looked, really looked, at the organized pantry, the lined baking trays, the open living room, the calm. It's beautiful, she said finally, voice subdued. I nodded. Thank you. We sat at the kitchen table, two adults no longer tangled in roles neither of us could survive. She commented on the sturdiness of the chairs, the depth of the sink, the amount of counter space. Neutral things, safe things. She didn't bring up the past. I didn't ask for explanations. No apology could rewrite the patterns that shaped us. No confession could return the versions of me that had been exhausted into silence. What we had instead was a moment of honest distance, two people acknowledging the space between us without pretending it wasn't there. When she rose to leave, she paused with her hand resting lightly on the doorframe. It wasn't a claim, it wasn't a blessing, just a small, almost hesitant recognition. The authority she once assumed over my life no longer lived here. The seasons turned, the bakery grew, my circle expanded, neighbors who noticed when the lights were on late, employees who told the truth without twisting it for pity, friends who asked how I was doing without implying that my well-being required a villain. My home became a gathering space, Friday potlucks, low-stakes game nights, debriefs over leftover pastries after brutal rushes. Laughter filled the rooms in a way that didn't require me to shrink or apologize or contort myself into the family's preferred shape. The Morrison boundary packet stayed where it always had, on the small table near the door. Untouched, but not ignored. Its presence didn't make me hard. It made me clear. I no longer rehearsed arguments in my head. No longer constructed invisible courtrooms where I defended myself to people who would never listen. No longer carried the fear that loving people meant dissolving myself for them. Some people will always cling to a version of you that makes their choices easier to live with. But your peace doesn't depend on their revision. My life now, the calm mornings, the steady business, the real relationships, exists because I stepped out of their script and into my own. And here's the truth I wish someone had told me years ago. You are allowed to protect the life you built. Even when the hands knocking at your door are familiar. Even when they claim history as leverage. Even when they call your clarity cruelty. Love without boundaries isn't generosity. It's erosion. And choosing a quieter, truer peace is not abandonment. It's survival. It's self-respect. It's the beginning of a life that finally makes sense. Wherever you're listening from, whatever time it is, whatever distance sits between you and the versions of yourself you've outgrown, I hope you carry this with you. You do not owe anyone access to the parts of your life they once harmed. You do not have to play the role they wrote for you. You get to choose your story. And sometimes choosing yourself is the most profound kind of forgiveness there is. Thank you for staying with this story until the end. If any part of it touched something in you, if it reminded you of the boundaries you've set or the peace you're trying to protect, please take a moment to like this video, subscribe, and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. Your support helps these stories reach the people who need them most. If you want more narratives about family, healing, and reclaiming your life, make sure to turn on the notification bell so you never miss the next chapter. Wherever you are, I hope you carry your own quiet strength forward. Thank you for being here.